Europe is far too weak and divided to stand in for the United States strategically, and without U.S. leadership, the West cannot survive. Thus, Joschka Fischer concluded on December 5, 2016, merely 11 years after concluding a service as Berlin's top diplomat and vice-chancellor, that the Western world, as virtually everyone alive today has known it, will almost certainly perish before our eyes. My answer to Mr. Fischer, however, is a resounding no. Despite a prolonged display of inadequate leadership on the global geostrategic chessboard, the evident and virtually ongoing failure to prepare for the worst that looms ahead, Europa, based on our Judeo-Christian values and historically proven strengths, will stand in the face of adversity. Good evening, I'm Jonathan Hessen, and this is the 20th edition of TV7 Europa Stands. Joining today's panel to dissect Europa's state of internal, foreign, and security-related affairs are retired General Klaus Naumann, who is formerly the chairman of NATO's military committee as well as the chief of defense of the Bundeswehr. Professor Uri Rosenthal, formerly the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Professor Jacek Czaputowicz, formerly the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland. And last but not least, Mr. Timo Soini, formerly the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Deputy Premier of Finland. It's good to see you all, and I'd like to immediately start with our first question. General Klaus, I'd like to hear your perspective on the current state of play of Europe, and are we inevitable in the course to destruction?
My answer to Joschka Fischer would also be a resounding no, for two main reasons. First, I think without Europe, the United States can no longer be a global power. They need us because we are the projection springboard for the projection of American power to all areas which matter east of Europe. And without Europe, the Americans will be limited to the Pacific. The one and only global maritime power would disappear without the European coastline. And my second point is, we may not always be happy with what we have achieved so far, but I believe the way in which we order our state, in which we offer our people an opportunity to live in freedom, governed by the rule of law, is the best formula which man have ever found for human beings living together. This is an incredible strength. We arrived at it after hundreds of years of trial and error, of bloody wars. But now we know that this is something we can offer as an incentive to others. We should not preach it. We should not ask others to join us. But it is in this world which is obviously faced with a competition between democracy and autocracy. It is a strong side of Europe. And for that reason, I think we will survive.
And yet, we're progressing forward. Tectonic shifts are occurring in front of our eyes, and we're waiting for the eruption. Does Europe have enough time to prepare itself for what's about to come?
Europe should actually, when I look over how things developed over the last few years, especially after the invasion by the Russians of Ukraine, you could say that the political leadership in Europe has been developing in a good direction. But the public at large in Europe is lagging behind. The famous phrase, if you cherish peace, you have to prepare for war. And I would say that for the public at large, this is far off their mindset. And I was thinking over the situation we have now, and I compare it to the situation in the immediate post-war period, 1945, 1955. And then we were discussing what was called the welfare proposition. And we built up a welfare state. Now we have this welfare state, and the question is whether people at large in Europe will be willing to upgrade substantially the expenditures for defense, for the military, and for that matter will be willing to sacrifice the welfare bonuses which we have had over the last decades. I think that is one of the big questions for Europe.
The will to sacrifice has been also a topic of discussion here on this panel. Professor Czaputowicz, is Europe prepared to sacrifice?
It's a good question, but I think that when we are looking at the relations with the United States, and I agree with General Naumann that Europe is an important ally for the US, but these relations are not symmetric. We need much more the US. We will not survive without alliance with the US as independent Europe or states in Europe, whereas the Americans can do it. So we need much more the US involvement in Europe that the US needs Europe. So this is my perspective of countries in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, for which American military presence and guarantees are crucial for our sovereignty. So this is why, in our opinion, in Poland and Central Europe, we should cherish, we should welcome, we should support alliance with the United States, and therefore even more invest, pay more costs for our security than it is done until now. So there is maybe lack of willingness to sacrifice in Western Europe particularly. Countries do not spend what they agreed enough for defense and for their military. They feel simply not threatened by Russia as we do in Eastern Europe. Therefore, it might be a problem. We have to unite, we have to be in solidarity with each other, we have to invest, we have to sacrifice from our well-being also to guarantee our security and strong ties with the United States.
Mr. Soini?
I agree with Jacek in that sense that especially former so-called communist countries who were under thumb of Soviet Union for decades, they know and they remember what it was like. And that is why they have met all the qualifications and criteria, including budget, to pay to the NATO their share.
But so has Finland.
So has Finland. Mm. But the free riders, they are in Hungary and they are in Western Europe. And that is also, if we look what kind of investments do the armies, there has been reduction also on the domestic size. There are only 3 countries in the NATO countries in Europe who has a conscription army. Turkey, Greece and Finland. And that tells you something about the reality in that sense.
Exactly.
But I also agree what the guys say about US commitment. It's a matter of utmost importance, and also like Jonathan, you said, there must be value-based stone, which is Judeo-Christian values. And if we are too scared for the political correctness reasons to say that aloud where the whole society is built, then it will be challenged. And we should be brave enough to say this is the cornerstone of our building, and then we have built it in the modern way.
General Naumann, I'd like to work on the latter point that Mr. Soini just mentioned, and that is the values that Europe has been founded upon and still strives to achieve to a certain degree, because it seems like certain sectors within various societies have somewhat, I'll keep it diplomatic, are far away from our perspectives here. And therefore, I'd like to touch on the fact that migration brings with it old values from their originating countries. Namely, we see the spread of Islam in Europe today, which during the last month or two have shown that there is a clash of civilizations in Europe, which threatens Western civilization at large. And at the same time, the values of families in Europe have not been promoted in a manner that would encourage the rise of birth rate as to meet the various quotas in order to contend with a growing economy.
Well, the observation is right. We developed a mentality of free riders because we placed all our hopes on the trust which emerged after the end of the Cold War. And this trust was the basis of politics, of cooperation. This trust was at the latest destroyed for a long time when Mr. Putin attacked without any justification Ukraine. And for that reason, there will be no cooperation for quite some time to come. We have to prepare for confrontation. And this will also lead to a change of our domestic attitudes. In this situation of confrontation, we cannot afford to tolerate everything in our countries. And we have to re-establish yardsticks, coordinates in which we can develop our societies, which would also mean that anyone who comes to us has to respect our way of life, our laws, our religion, and has to accept it if he wants to stay as a host in this country. Those who don't do it have to go back. And they cannot expect to be free riders in social welfare at our expenses. That is a dramatic change which will happen. And our politicians have to wake up to this. We can no longer follow the line which governed Germany for 16 years to make it okay for everyone. The only thing is to live in a welfare state and to enjoy warm water every morning. That's not the way we can live. We have to prepare. You mentioned earlier sacrifices. Yes, we have to be prepared to change, and that means sacrifice. That means to be prepared to have the will to defend this way of life and to accept and to ask others who come to respect our orders as we respect their way of life.
Which is clearly not the case at the moment, nor in Germany or in the Netherlands for that matter. This has brought a wave of voting in support of Geert Wilders, which nobody predicted. Everybody expected it to be quite differently, to say the least. Nonetheless, you will still see those protests, threats, criminal organizations from foreign countries sweeping across the Netherlands and threatening Dutch society at large.
You're quite right. And the situation is bleak. We see, if I may say so, in my country, we notice a amalgam, a mixture of heavy criminal activities by cartels, not just on the European end, but with their connections to Latin America, etc. And they mix up, believe it or not, with the long arm of Iran and other terrorism-prone countries in the Middle East. We have people who are now under extremely severe personal protection. A friend of mine, who is in my committee for Free Iran, is already for 6 months under heavy personal surveillance. Why? Because it seems to be that there is a threat from that faraway country, Iran, together with their hired murderers from the drugs cartels. That is the situation in my country not only, but also in Belgium, in France, and where have you. And people are not understanding, when we are talking confrontation, we are not just talking confrontation with autocracies all over the world, but also with specific countries which really actually try to exploit the softness and the fragility of our societies.
Democracy works so long as society wants it to work. The moment it's a different type of society that originates from autocracies and seeks to alter it in their advantage, naturally, there are consequences to that. Nevertheless, Poland has been quite wise in fending off, also for economic reasons, of course, but also it has sought to maintain the Christian values that it was founded upon. To what degree is this still within the discourse of the current government, since there was a shift to the left?
That's right. So, but generally, Poland is a Christian country with a population going to church every Sunday and with traditional values deeply rooted in society. But referring also to migration, we are countries with a border of the European Union. We are responsible for that border. So we have to stop illegal migration coming particularly from Belarus. For Lukashenko, it is a useful instrument to influence European Union. So when we are discussing the role of migration, the policy vis-à-vis migration within the European Union, Poland is against rather redistribution or relocation of migrants who came illegally to Europe. We are rather for stopping them at the border. They are illegal migrants. So, and it is our responsibility, and the current government continues this policy of previous government. There is a discussion also in Poland referring to liberal values. The current coalition is more open to postulates referring to abortion at certain stage. And there is also a discussion that and observance that these Christian values, also pro-family policy, is not effective because birth rate is unfortunately low in Poland in comparing to other countries. Probably it is, the reason of that is that people live in different world than previously. And indeed, Muslim families are much more conservative and they have much more children in Western Europe. There's not much of them in Poland. And it changes also the spectrum of Western society. So we have to observe that. So there is a threat from within to our values we share, liberal values or Christian values, Judeo-Christian values, if you wish. But also there is a threat from outside. I read a memoir of Polish diplomat in 30s last century. He was appointed in Cairo, and he wrote in his memoir, there is a growing number of people. There is 18 million Egyptians at that time. And he said, half of that in Poland at that time. And today, there's 1 million Egyptians, and our number of population remains the same since the Second World War. So 6-time growth in comparison. Relations.
2025, the Egyptian population will reach 105 million. In just a couple years, reaching 5 more million is quite impressive.
Therefore, it shows how quickly the situation changes in terms of relations between different religious groups and different cultures, and the importance in terms of population of different states. And we have to be aware of that. Therefore, there is a pressure on Europe from Africa at that stage.
Well, it also has to do with sacrifice, but that's for another discussion. There's been also no issues right now with hybrid migration. That's a joke, of course. The Russians have been quite active in reallocating and rediverting young men coming from Iraq, from Syria, from elsewhere.
Yeah, since we last met on the combination, now the Finnish border to Russia is closed. We used to have 7 to 8 points, crossing points, where to go to Russia, to St. Petersburg and very up. Now the border is closed. And why is that? Because they used public, so people as vessels. They were young people coming over to Finland just to seek asylum, whichever country. And they were coming first tens, then hundreds, and now you cannot cross the border to Russia anywhere from Finland. And this is a huge change. And all the ties, economic ties, also human ties, are collapsed. If you want to go to Russia from Finland, you must go via Estonia or via Latvia, or then you must fly over to Istanbul and take a flight from Istanbul to Russia. And that is, I also agree what Jacek said about the population. Our hips are drying. We are not getting babies enough in the Western world, and this is a huge, huge problem. And also what comes to criminality, what Uri said, it is, if something has going international, it's the crime. Cybercrime, hybrid crime, we are okay with the old crooks who rob the bank or make a robbery or burglary. That's not anything. Combined, what have come instead, drugs, cryptocurrency frauds, and all kinds of frauds which are done by the computer. And I think on this size, whole Europe, and especially US, which have the Google and which have the X and whatever the surfaces, this is a matter of utmost importance to have cooperation on this size.
Let's divert to the fact that we're currently in the 2-year anniversary of, or at least this month was the 2-year anniversary of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. We had also the anniversary, the 10-year anniversary of the Russian invasion into Crimea. General Naumann, when you look at the situation, can Europe be reassured of a certain situation in which Ukraine can, or at least remain steadfast in protecting its territory, or are we starting to see a shift, unfortunately, where the latest losses of territory are going to be just the beginning or the tip of the iceberg?
Well, I hope that our fellow Europeans understand the gravity of the situation. Should Ukraine fall, then we will fall next, or we will see war in Europe. I have little doubt that Putin will try to achieve what he really stated crystal clear in December 21. He wants to reinstall the Russian Empire. And if we don't succeed in supporting Ukraine as much as we can, and to help them at least to stop the Russian invasion. And if we don't help them to achieve their fully justified and legally absolutely correct objective of restoring their territorial integrity, which had been guaranteed by Russia in exchange for the Ukrainian nuclear weapons in 1994. If we don't succeed in doing so, we will give up the central and elementary principle of European security, that no border should be ever changed by the use of force. If we give this up, then we are at the edge of a quagmire, and we will end up in a period of uncertainty and insecurity for an undefined period of time. And our citizens have to understand that. I have the impression, if I look at my country, the citizens understand the gravity of the situation much better than the leading politicians. And if the politicians would listen to the people, then we might be better off.
Well, then we would also produce some leaders, but unfortunately that's not the case at this stage. Professor Rosenthal, I'm quite curious as to your reaction to this, because when I look at the Netherlands, I look at Belgium, I look at other countries, it doesn't seem to be quite resolute in ratcheting up the own domestic military power, but also the support for Ukraine is also very limited. And it goes for all West European countries for that matter.
I'm afraid you are right, and I would love to see the population of my country and from some other Western countries to have the same resolve which Klaus is indicating for his country.
For the people, not for the government.
For the people, no, but the striking remark by Timo was about the inclination to do something about the strength of our armed forces, to have also this connect between the political and military leaders and the people by this eternal kind of instrument called conscription.
Yeah.
And this is lacking.
Yeah.
And I don't see for the years to come an reactivation of our constitutional clause that people should be ready to serve in the armed forces.
Even though there is a discussion ongoing about this in most countries.
Absolutely, but yeah. I don't see it twisting to the good side. I don't see that. And if you talk about the, let me say, the fragility at the moment, at this very moment, of the support for Ukraine, military, financially, reconstruction, then I would say that with this, you mentioned it already, these political winds going to the far right, where there is still this ill-famous, this nasty love for Putin, I say it as it is, then my impression is that a lot has to be done to bridge the gap between the political and military leaders in, for instance, my country and the public.
Briefly.
May I interject one thought in this debate about conscription? We Europeans are in a situation where we have to get ready to defend our countries in very limited and very short time. We do not have much more time than 3 to 5 years.
And that's the disconnect with the leadership.
And if we don't take maximum advantage of this time to get ready to defend our countries, to defend Europe, then we cannot afford to offer to the armed forces the additional task of reintroducing conscription. We would weaken them. The first thing is to get ready for defense, and then we can talk about conscription.
Okay, I would hope for this, at least an open debate on the advantages of conscription, that open debate helps in any case to make the people at large aware of the situation we are in. You are right from a military, technical kind of perspective. But if you want to make people at large realize the situation we are in, they should be confronted right away with the consequences of it. And of course, making sacrifices on the welfare side of the equation is a really quite a thing. But for the younger people in the Netherlands, and also the parents of these younger people, to understand that it may at a certain moment be that they should may be ready at a certain moment to serve in the armed forces and even to sacrifice, their life, that is another.
I would give the Dutch people more credit. Personally,
Wonderful.
I hope I'm correct. I may be wrong on this, but nevertheless, Professor Czaputowicz, when we look at Poland, it has been a leading force, the strongest or the rising military power in Europe, as we see it, and with quite the keen eye and clear eye with regard to the threats looming. Do you see this an ongoing process?
As far as our contribution and investment in military is concerned, yes, we spent 4% of our GDP, and there is a continuation of that policy with a new government.
So if I may immediately also follow up to the extension of this, is Poland ready to confront a reality in which Russia would continue, potentially win in Ukraine and move? We just heard also what's happening in Moldova, calling on Russia to enter.
So this is, I agree that the situation on the front is pessimistic from the side of Ukraine. For Vladimir Putin, he is just before the election. It's a success. They just conquered Bakhmut and recently Avdiivka, important places, and they go farther to the west. So the very bad development, negative development, also due to the mistakes made by Western countries. We, the West, Europe, but particularly the United States, promised Ukrainians support, military support. They told them, Zelensky, you have to fight, we will provide you with weapons. The United States is paralyzed. There is no decision concerning continuation of weapons. Therefore, the situation is very difficult. And it is also our responsibility. From our perspective, I mean Poland's perspective and Central European countries, Eastern European countries, key for our security is American presence in Europe. Because until they stay in Europe, until there is an American military presence in Poland, we feel ourselves secure, safe. There is 10,000 American troops in Poland. If they leave, it will be a bad sign and good for Putin. Will be open, will be vulnerable. For next few years, I agree with General, it will be very difficult to be ready to fight on our own as Europe is concerned. Therefore, in our policy, this alliance with the United States is very important, not depending who will win the election. We have to maintain that presence and we have to do everything to convince Americans that this alliance is also valuable for them. So this is how we perceive that situations, because the US is the only deterrence efficient for Russians. and guarantee that they would not go farther. But we have to hope also that the Ukrainians stop them, and it will be a breakthrough both in the United States and in the European Union, and this support will be provided.
With that being said, however, if we see a reality and the United States is not preparing to contend with Russia, it's preparing to contend with China. And if it needs to focus on the Pacific, naturally, it will have to reallocate some funds, and it will come at the expense of the transatlantic alliance, in a sense where Europe will have to be prepared to confront and challenge Russia and deter it enough in order to ensure that the Atlantic is safe.
I am not certain if it's a good, so to say, understanding of the situation, because one thing, this is an alliance which is criticized. NATO is criticized in some countries within NATO by Donald Trump, for example, but there are also countries which spend enough. And I can imagine the situation that it will be an agreement on bilateral basis. The presence, American presence in Poland, 10,000 soldiers with equipment, it is based on our bilateral relations, like with Korea or Japan. I can imagine it won't be a perfect solution. It would be much better if NATO exists. But we have to think about our security, notwithstanding the development in other, Portugal, Luxembourg, and other countries. So for us, the value of alliance with the US is much bigger than from other countries which are not threatened by Russia.
Not to forget Finland, of course, now member of NATO, Sweden just
to enter. I agree with Jacek in that sense that we also had a bilateral agreement, so-called DCA agreement, which is bilateral with US. It's in addition to, it's not that the NATO is good, but it's not enough, because this DCA is telling what kind of weaponry we can have, what kind of training we can have, what kind of joint planning we could have with them, and of course the NATO planning as itself. But I want to say one detail about the conscription army. I was there 40 years ago, and with one room when we started 40 years ago, there was guys called Rantala, Rautoma, Rintaniemi, Soini, Sinisalo, Sakko, Tevilin. I remember all the 7 guys who were in my very room 40 years ago. And this is what the conscription does. We were totally, one was a doctor, one was in the university, one was in the carpenter, one was a dockman. And this is how it is so important to get the cohesion inside the public. And then good news, I think Poland has been a good news, but the surprisingly good news has been Prime Minister Meloni. She has been outstanding in many sense what comes to Russia, what comes to Europe, what comes to European Christian values. I just hope that the Italian economy doesn't collapse. And he's the one who keeps, for example, Salvini at the bay at the moment.
Well, General Naumann, I'd like to move to another theater that has quite the significant implications, and that is the asymmetric and hybrid conflicts emerging in different locations, with chief focus right now, for the sake of our discussion, on the Red Sea, where the Iranian proxy Ansar Allah, dominated by the Houthi tribe, is attacking maritime shipping, much of which includes also commodity seafare in order that is bound for Europe, and has quite the severe implications not only for Europe at large, but Germany in particular, which has now joined the EU task force in the Red Sea, namely the Hessen vessel, to contend with this threat. Well, what do you make out of that?
Well, it is a form of hybrid warfare which we see. And for that reason, the German government took the right decision to deploy a frigate to the Red Sea. And just yesterday, this frigate shot down for the first time 2 attacking drones successfully. they will continue to do so. And we should learn from that the freedom of the high seas, whether it is in the Red Sea or whether it is in the West Pacific or in the Straits of Malacca, is a vital interest of European security. And we have to be prepared to contribute to that. We cannot leave it to the Americans and be free riders once again. We have to think it through. And there's another point which one should mention, particularly in presence of a politician from a country which has an Arctic dimension as well. We will see an ice-free Arctic Ocean, which makes the communications, the world's most important maritime communication for approximately 5,000 sea miles shorter than we do it right now. We have to be prepared to protect it. Again, a point of conflict with Russia, which believes to be the master of the Arctic Sea. We have to think it through. We have no time to debate it endlessly, but it is part of our security, and for that reason I'm quite happy that the German government took the decision. I'm not happy with the parallelity of American, British and EU things, since I'm a simple-minded soldier who believes in the unity of command. And what this would mean, we saw just the day before yesterday, when the German frigate was not aware of an American drone traveling somewhere, and they fortunately unsuccessfully tried to engage this American drone.
Well, fortunately, for that matter, but nonetheless, when I look at this, it's merely a plaster on a disease that needs to be remedied elsewhere. And that is, namely, the Islamic Republic of Iran happens to be the one brokering, supporting, facilitating those attacks, and therefore also beyond its sale just recently of roughly 400 ballistic missiles to Russia, other one-way suicide drones, so to speak. We heard the Deputy Commander of Central Command, Vice Admiral Bradford Cooper, coming out and saying the Iranians are there shoulder to shoulder with the Houthis, and we can degrade them to the point of no return if and when the policy is made, and therefore, can the policy be made at this point in time?
Well, talking Iran, we have the Hamas, we have the Hezbollah, we have the Houthis, we have the militias in both Syria and Iraq. And we have a country, Iran, which is really now at the last barrier to going full-fledgedly nuclear. The Board of Governors of the IAEA is convening next week. What we know about it is that Iran is going ahead. My concern is with the fact that our usual instruments are not up to the challenge from the Iranian side. If I look at the diplomatic scene over the last year, I don't see any effective results in the relation to Iran. Allow me to broaden it a little bit, if I may, very shortly. You're talking asymmetry. What strikes me is that the Westphalian order, Kissinger's Westphalian order of states holding the thing in their own hands, is being, I would say, contaminated by the surge of non-state actors, not only proxies of Iran, but also, we talked about it already, international crime, if I may say so, also by the huge increase in power of NGOs, all over the world, which makes also for it is damaging the old ways of doing business on the global scene between states.
Yeah.
That is my concern at the moment.
And putting that in mind, and I'd like to ask you, Professor Czaputowicz, Qatargate, just a couple of years ago, we heard about this massive scandal where the Qataris pretty much bribed 167 individuals within NGOs, leading NGOs, which are utilizing and won tenders of taxpayers from the European Union, as well as senior members of parliament in the European Union and other high-level individuals. This investigation is still ongoing, so of course we don't have all of the details at hand. But what are we doing in order to facilitate a reality in which decision makers and lawmakers, for that matter, maintain the interests of Europe at heart, nation states within Europe, rather than their own corrupt schemes?
Yeah, that's right. You're right. I agree with the description. Also, the importance of corruption as an instrument to influence our internal European affairs by rich countries like Qatar. In that case, I believe that these corrupt people will be soon eliminated by voters, because we'll have election to European Parliament, and hopefully let's expect that they will not get support. But the problem exists. It shows how difficult it is, and that also European parliamentarists, MPs, but also civil servants should be monitored from that perspective. So it is very important. But as far as global perception of Westphalian order is concerned, I think that there is a kind of a division now, that some countries are stronger and stronger and others are weaker. And there is a differentiation of countries. And unfortunately, some scholars expected that authoritarian countries are more effective these days, like Vladimir Putin, in conducting foreign policies. And democracies are influenced from outside, and they are not effective. They are divided. There's an antagonistic groups, like in the United States we can observe today. They cannot finalize decision relating to military support to Ukraine, or like in Poland recently, that there is a kind of a fight within the government in many other countries. So it's a sad conclusion that sometimes the unity, which is easier preserve, maintain under authoritarian leadership, becomes more effective. China is another example. On the other side, of course, democracies has much more potential to develop new technologies and to elect better people to power. But still, there is a fight between these two groups of kind of structures, state structures, and unfortunately, these days, Vladimir Putin, China, other authoritarian regimes, Iran, are more effective, and the West doesn't have instruments to stop them. Sanctions doesn't work against Iran. We said I fully agree with the danger.
It could work, but there needs to be follow-up.
Yeah.
Yes, the West is not united. They are not effective. Also, sanctions against Russia very recently announced by the United States. But will they be implemented? And Russia changes economy. It's effective. It's not influenced by sanctions. It develops better. It produces twice as much weapons as Europe and United States combined in terms of munition. So it's easier to change its economy to this war economy, and it's unfortunate conclusion and very dangerous for situation for the Western world.
The governments in the West are lagging behind, Mr. Soini.
Yeah, I think that democracy has a vast power if it trusts to itself. because there are two purposes why the parliaments exist: accepting the laws and accepting the budget. They have the money and they have the law. And should they use them properly, they should be very strong. But now, like Uri said, there are all kinds of NGOs who are stealing the scenery in the way because democracy is slow and they are very quick in the modern technological world. And if you want to scrutinize them, where does your money come from? What are your books? Who is funding you? Who are you hiring? They refuse to tell. And this is something that the democracy should challenge them and say that you are not representing the whole people. We cannot change you. Our politicians, every 4th year, you can vote us in, you can vote us out. And we should raise a backbone to the European democracies to defend themselves and also recommend that the same medicine to US.
Democracy, of course, has a significant value.
Yeah.
And that is the fact that we have freedom. And this freedom is secure so long as the rules-based order that was erected in order to preserve that freedom is maintained. And for that purpose, of course, we need always to remember that freedom comes at a cost. And if you're late at your payments for that cost, at some point that freedom will be taken away. And therefore, I'd like to ask you, General Naumann, when we're looking at the broad scheme of things, you just recently published a report that I had the privilege of reading, and you highlighted that we may well be already in World War III, and that the governments have not yet realized it.
Governments and people, yes. I think we are in a global confrontation, and we have to understand that we have one instrument which we have to preserve at all cost, and that is our unity in our Western world. If we permit to be split up, then we are bound to lose against the autocracies. And the other point which we have to understand, and which I think our people have to understand, is the situation in which we could expand the welfare cost more or less without any limits and neglect the protection of the state and the defense of the state, these days are gone. And we need to understand that we have to prepare ourselves for defense, that we have to spend the necessary money, and first and foremost, that we have the will to fight if necessary.
And I would like to take that as a prelude for our final statements of each of you. Where are we heading in the next month, and what should leaders listening right now, and generally the public looking right now, focus on prior to our next production next month?
I would say, leaving aside the arenas in the Pacific, China, Taiwan, the Sahel, Middle East, looking at Europe, I would say that we should do our utmost to help out Ukraine in its fight for freedom. And the fight for freedom not for the Ukrainian people alone, but for us as well.
Professor Czaputowicz?
March is the month when we will celebrate the 25th anniversary of membership of Poland and other countries from the region in NATO. It's a very symbolic day, but also we will celebrate soon the 75th anniversary of NATO, which it was a very successful, has been very successful alliance. I hope that the decision in the United States will be taken and the Ukraine will be supported, because it is key to preserve peace and also make Ukraine that they can continue fight.
I hope also that the cynicism of domestic politics will not be embroiled in this pushing forward all kind of bills that have dual-edged swords to them. Mr. Soini?
Yeah, I think that it's very important that we support Ukraine wholeheartedly, and it was very good that Mr. Naumann pointed out why we are in this situation. We are in this situation partly because of Ukraine make a deal that they were getting rid of the nuclear missiles. They were making a deal which all the West and Russia guaranteed their safety. And that promise has been broken. And if we now broke Ukraine second time, not defending, not the helping, what kind of example it is for each of us to be helped when attacked? And this is security question, but this is deeply a moral question. Can we be taken seriously also in the future?
Gerald Naumann, in history, the Westphalia Treaties of 1648 ultimately defined nation states. However, it came at a very terrible cost. Roughly 1/4 of all German population,
40%.
40%, even more than that, was killed. The 80 Years' War in the Netherlands and Spain,
Absolutely.
the Austro-Hungarian Empire was in shambles. In one sentence, can we avoid such a catastrophe before reaching such a treaty?
Yeah, I think we can. The formula for that has served us for 75 years, has preserved peace. And it is very simple. If one of us came under attack, it's an attack on us all. And that we have to keep up. And to that end, we have to spend and we have to have the will to stand. Europe stands and Europe will fight.
General Naumann, Professor Rosenthal, Professor Czaputowicz, and Mr. Soini, thank you so very much for this lively discussion. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Helsinki, good evening. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.